"Throw this one out," Lydia said, dropping the folder on Marcus Bennett's desk. "No license history beyond a delivery van, no references from anywhere that matters, and is applying for a driver position at a logistics company that runs national contracts." Marcus barely looked up until he saw the name typed at the top, Daniel Cole. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. 2 years driving a borrowed delivery van. Before that, nothing on paper at all. A resume that any recruiter in the building would reject in 4 seconds. But Marcus's hand had gone still, because 11 years ago, on a flooded highway outside the city at 2 in the morning, a stranger in a rusted pickup truck had pulled his car out of a ditch, refused payment, and driven off into the rain without ever giving his name. Since that night, Marcus had built Bennett Freight Solutions from 3 trucks into a logistics network spanning 4 states. He had been profiled in 2 business magazines. He had told the story of the man who saved my life at exactly one award dinner, vaguely, without details, because he never had any to give. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't know his face well. Not really, just a silhouette in headlights and a voice that hadn't asked for anything. Now a name was sitting on his desk attached to a job application for a driver position 3 pay grades below entry level. Marcus didn't explain anything to Lydia. He simply closed the folder and said, "Clear my 11 o'clock, and don't tell HR anything yet." Lydia had worked under Marcus long enough to know that tone wasn't anger. It was the sound of something old being disturbed. She nodded and left without asking why. Marcus spent the next half hour reading the application 3 times, not because it was complicated. It was barely 2 pages, but because of one line near the bottom, where most applicants wrote about ambition or experience. Daniel had written, "Available for any route that gets me home by 7 p.m. My son has dialysis 3 times a week, and I'm the one who takes him." Not hard-working. Not team player. Just a sentence that told Marcus everything the man needed, and nothing about what he wanted in return. He remembered the night in pieces, the way memory keeps things it was never asked to keep. He'd been 31 then, driving back from a supplier meeting that had gone badly, the kind of meeting where you leave knowing the deal that would have saved your company just collapsed in front of you. The rain had been the heaviest the region had seen in 6 years. His car had slid off the shoulder near a stretch of highway with no street lights, no phone signal, and no one likely to pass before morning. He'd sat there for 40 minutes, calculating how many more meetings he could afford to miss, how many more weeks the company had before the bank stopped extending grace. When headlights appeared behind him, a man got out without hesitation, looked at the angle of the car for 2 seconds, and went back to his truck for a tow chain he clearly kept for exactly this kind of night. He hooked it up in the rain without being asked, pulled the car free, checked that the engine still turned over, and was back in his truck before Marcus could finish saying thank you. When Marcus tried to give him money, everything in his wallet, which wasn't much that year, the man had waved it off through the rolled-down window and said, "Just get home safe," before disappearing into the dark. Marcus had made the next morning's meeting. The deal that mattered, the one after the failed one, had gone through. He always said, when he told the story at all, that a stranger had saved his company that night. He never mentioned that he'd spent 11 years occasionally scanning crowds for a face he wasn't sure he'd even recognize. Now he had a name, and a 2-page application for a driver position. Daniel Cole arrived at 11 o'clock sharp, wearing a collared shirt that had clearly been pressed with care and had still lost its fight with the heat outside. His shoes were clean but resoled, the stitching along the sides slightly uneven where he'd done it himself. He looked around the lobby once, not with awe, but with the practical attention of a man checking exits, noting where the loading bay probably was, calculating distances out of old habit. When Lydia brought him into Marcus's office instead of the HR interview room, he paused at the door and said he thought there had been a mix-up. He'd applied for a driving position, not a meeting with the owner. Marcus told him there was no mix-up and asked him to sit. Daniel sat, rested his hands on his knees, and waited. He didn't feel the silence. People who'd spent years being evaluated by people who held their paychecks learned to do one of 2 things: over-explain, or go still. Daniel went still. Marcus told him about the highway, the rain, the tow chain, the 11 years of not knowing a name to put to the face. Daniel's expression shifted slowly, not surprise exactly, more like watching a door open onto a room he hadn't expected to walk back into. "That was you," he said. "It wasn't a question. I've been trying to find you since," Marcus said. "And then your application landed on my desk." Daniel nodded slowly, turning it over the way Marcus suspected he turned over most things, checking the weight of it before deciding what it meant. He said he appreciated that Marcus remembered, but it had been a long time, and he'd just done what seemed obvious that night. Marcus said he understood Daniel saw it that way. He also said he'd read the full application, including the 2 years driving the delivery van, and he had a different proposal, one Daniel should hear in full before deciding anything. The Westbrook warehouse contract had been on Bennett Freight's books for 8 months. A cold chain distribution route delivering insulin, vaccines, and other temperature-sensitive medical supplies to 43 rural clinics across 3 districts. The kind of contract that looked excellent in a press release and was brutally complicated to execute, because half those clinics were on roads that flooded every monsoon and weren't on any GPS system that updated correctly. The company had good drivers. What it lacked was someone who understood those roads from the inside, not from a route planning app, but from years of actually driving rural delivery routes, knowing which bridges flooded first, which shortcuts turned to mud, which villages had unmarked detours that saved 40 minutes if you knew them and cost 2 hours if you didn't. Marcus offered Daniel a 30-day position as route reliability coordinator for the Westbrook contract, not symbolic, a real working role. Ride every route once, flag any discrepancy between the planned delivery windows and road reality, and help redesign the schedule so the cold chain boxes never sat in trucks longer than their cooling units could hold temperature. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Daniel didn't say yes. He looked at the table and said he needed to be straight about something. He understood this was a better opportunity than the one he'd applied for. He also understood how it would look, a man with no formal logistics background suddenly placed in a coordinator role connected to the owner by a favor from 11 years ago. He said that wasn't a story he wanted attached to him, and if Marcus was offering this out of guilt, he'd rather just take the driving job and be done with it. Marcus said he wasn't offering it because of the highway. He was offering it because the same quality he'd seen in a stranger pulling a car out of a ditch in the rain for no reward was exactly what this contract needed. Someone who did the right thing because it didn't occur to him to do otherwise. Daniel was quiet a moment. Then he asked 3 things: that the story between them never appear in any company material, that his pay reflect the actual scope of the role, not inflated as a gesture, not reduced to seem modest, and that if after 30 days he wasn't adding real value, he'd leave without argument. Marcus agreed to all 3 without negotiating. They shook hands. Daniel's grip was firm and made nothing of itself. Westbrook didn't look like a contract on the verge of anything historic. It looked like what it was: a gravel yard, 6 aging trucks, and a dispatch office with a ceiling fan that wobbled audibly. Daniel showed up the first morning with a notebook, a tire gauge, and a thermos. He introduced himself to both dispatch leads by name and asked if anyone had the original road survey from when the contract was signed, not the route planning software's version, the original paper survey. The dispatch lead, a heavy-set man named Derek, said they worked off the app now. Daniel said he understood that and asked again about the paper survey. Derek said it was probably in a filing cabinet somewhere, if it still existed. Daniel spent the first 4 days doing nothing that looked impressive. He rode along on every route once, sitting in the passenger seat with his notebook, timing each leg, noting which culverts had standing water even in dry weather, which clinic intake staff were never there before 9 despite the delivery window saying 8:30. He photographed the cooling unit's internal thermometers at pickup and at delivery. He didn't speak much in the morning briefings unless asked directly. He just measured. On the 5th day, he flagged his first discrepancy. The route plan had truck 4 delivering to the Fairview Clinic by 9:15 a.m., well within the insulin's cooling window. According to what Daniel had clocked 3 separate mornings, the actual drive time, accounting for a bridge that floods every monsoon and forces a 40-minute detour, was closer to 10:40. The cooling units weren't rated to hold temperature that long once the ice pack started cycling. He wrote it up with photographs and timestamps and submitted it through the dispatch software. The reply came back within the hour from the operations manager, a man named Kyle Norton, who wrote that the route had passed certification testing, and the schedule would stand as designed. Kyle copied the company's regional director, Trevor Pike, on the reply. Daniel read the message twice, printed it, and folded it into his notebook. The rumors started in the 2nd week, faster than Daniel expected, but not faster than he prepared for. He heard the first version from a fellow driver named Carl, who seemed to feel Daniel deserved to know what was being said. that the new coordinator had been brought in because of some personal connection to the owner, that he had no real logistics training, and that the team was being asked to slow down for someone who couldn't read a route map. Daniel thanked Carl and went back to work. The version that reached Trevor Pike was sharper. Trevor drove out to the Westbrook yard on a Thursday, a visit the dispatch team found unusual, since the regional director hadn't come out in person in over a year. He found Daniel in the yard, cross-referencing his hand-timed logs against the route software's printed schedule. Trevor said he wanted to be direct. Daniel said he appreciated that. Trevor said he was sure Daniel understood this contract carried real weight for the company, that 2 more rural districts were watching how this rollout went before signing their own cold chain contracts, and that anything slowing the timeline would have consequences beyond this one route. He said he wasn't questioning Daniel's intentions. He was questioning whether his role made sense given the pressure the company was under. Daniel set down his notebook. He said he understood the pressure Trevor was describing. He also said he documented 3 timing discrepancies in 2 weeks, all submitted through the proper channel, and that operations had closed 2 of them as non-issues without anyone actually riding the route at the times he flagged. Trevor's expression didn't change. He said documentation was exactly the kind of thing that could slow a rollout down if it wasn't managed carefully. Daniel looked at him steadily. "Is that what you'd like me to do? Manage the documentation?" Trevor didn't answer that directly. He said he wanted Daniel to understand the full picture, then left without saying anything further. What Daniel found in week 3 wasn't a timing issue. It was a substitution. He'd been tracking the cooling units themselves, the insulated boxes that kept vaccine shipments within their required range during transit. The contract-specified units rated to hold temperature for 6 hours without active cooling, because several of the routes had stretches with no power source to plug in a backup compressor. The units actually loaded onto the trucks were a different model. The part numbers were close enough to pass a glance at the delivery manifest. The rated hold time on the units actually in use was 4 hours, not 6. Daniel checked 3 trucks personally, photographed the model plates against the contract spec sheet, and pulled the supplier invoices. The invoices listed the correct 6-hour units. The boxes physically on the trucks were not those units. He brought it to Kyle first. Kyle said the difference was within an acceptable margin given that most routes ran under 5 hours anyway. Daniel asked what happened on the 2 routes that ran over 5 hours during monsoon day tours, the exact situation he'd already documented in week 1. Kyle said the safety margins accounted for variance. Daniel asked if anyone had actually tested the substituted units under a real 5.5-hour route in August heat. Kyle said he'd take it under consideration. His tone made clear he wouldn't. Daniel went back to his desk and wrote the full report himself, model numbers, rated hold times, invoice records, photographs, and the exact scenario where delayed route combined with the wrong unit would let a vaccine shipment exceed its safe temperature range before reaching clinic. He submitted it through the system and sent a copy directly to Marcus. Marcus called him that evening. Daniel was at the kitchen table going through his son Ethan's dialysis schedule for the week when the phone rang. He told Ethan he'd be 5 minutes and stepped into the hallway. Marcus said he'd read the report and asked Daniel to walk him through it. Daniel did, without editorializing, the math, the temperature curve, what happened to insulin in certain vaccines once they crossed their threshold for too long. He said the system would probably work fine through the dry season. He said it would very likely fail the first time a monsoon D2 combined with a hot afternoon, and that fail meant spoiled medicine reaching a rural clinic that had no way of knowing it, because nothing about the box would look wrong from the outside. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then asked what Daniel thought he should do. Daniel said that wasn't his decision to make. He documented what he found as completely as he could, and what happened with it was above his level. Marcus said he appreciated that, but he was asking anyway. Daniel said he should pause new shipments on the affected routes and have the units independently tested. He said Marcus should also look carefully at how the substitution happened, because correct invoices paired with incorrect physical units didn't look like an accident to him. After the call, Daniel went back to the kitchen. Ethan had finished marking his dialysis days on the calendar and was drawing something on the back of the page. He looked up and asked if everything was okay. Daniel said yes, and sat back down. Everything was not okay. By the next morning, a summary of Daniel's report had circulated through a management thread he hadn't been included on. The framing was different from what he'd written. where Daniel had submitted a technical analysis with photographs and invoice numbers. The summary described concerns raised by the route coordinator, language that reduced documented evidence to a matter of one man's opinion. Trevor responded in the thread, noting that Daniel's role was route logistics, not procurement oversight, and that operations had already reviewed the concern and found it within acceptable parameters. By afternoon, a dispatch supervisor told Daniel a story was circulating that he'd been placed in the role without proper hiring process, that his report was being read as an attempt to justify his position by manufacturing a problem, and that regional leadership had been made aware. 3 days later, Daniel's access to the dispatch software was restricted pending a review of documentation submitted outside standard protocol. He read the notice at his desk in the yard office. Outside, he could see one of the cold chain trucks idling, waiting on a delayed clinic order. That evening, Daniel told himself he should probably let it go. He'd documented everything. He'd gone through the proper channel, then gone directly to Marcus when the channel failed. He'd done what could reasonably be asked of him, and the company's machinery was now moving in a direction no individual could easily reverse. He thought about Ethan's dialysis schedule, about the steadiness this job had finally given them after 2 years of an unreliable delivery van income. He thought about what it meant to walk away now versus what it meant to be pushed out with a story already written about him. Then Trevor found him. It was after the yard had emptied for the evening. Trevor came alone, without his tablet, without the careful posture from their first conversation. He sat down across from Daniel in the empty dispatch office and said he wasn't there officially. He said he didn't think Daniel was wrong. He said it plainly, without softening it. But then he said the company had 2 more contracts riding on this rollout going smoothly, that the investors backing the cold chain expansion had tied further funding to an on-schedule, dispute-free launch, and that if this became a public problem, it wasn't just a company that absorbed the cost. It was 43 clinics that would lose reliable medical delivery for who knew how long while the fallout got sorted. He said he understood that wasn't Daniel's problem to carry. He said he was telling him anyway because he wanted him to understand the pressure wasn't personal. Daniel listened to all of it. Then he said he understood the stakes Trevor was describing. He also said a cooling system that failed under exactly the conditions it was supposed to handle wasn't a working system. It was a liability with a contract attached to it. And the people who'd pay for that weren't the ones in this room. Trevor didn't respond. He picked up his jacket and left. Daniel drove out to the Fairview Clinic that night and sat in the parking lot for a while. He told himself he was checking whether the morning's shipment had arrived intact, which was a real concern and also not the whole reason he was there. He walked toward the clinic. Through a lit window, he saw a nurse logging in a delivery, checking a small refrigerator's internal thermometer against a clipboard. On a bench outside, an elderly man sat with his daughter, waiting for the pharmacy window to reopen in the morning, because they traveled 2 hours and had nowhere else to stay the night. Daniel stood there a moment. Then he walked back to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and made a decision he understood would cost him something. He wasn't sure exactly what yet, but he understood the shape of the choice. There was a version where he protected himself, and a version where he didn't, and the units would fail under the wrong conditions either way. The only real question left was whether anyone who knew that had said so while it still mattered. He drove home, helped Ethan with his homework, put him to bed, and sat at the kitchen table finishing the documentation he'd started before his access was cut off, working from copies he'd saved on his own laptop. The rain came 2 nights later, the kind the Weather Service called moderate, but that a drainage system unrepaired since the contract planning phase experienced as something closer to severe. Truck 4 left for the Fairview route at 6 a.m. into standing water that hadn't been there in the dry season test runs. The monsoon detour added 50 extra minutes. By the time the truck reached the clinic, the cooling units had been running 4 hours and 20 minutes, 20 minutes past their actual rated hold time. The shipment looked fine from the outside. The nurse logging it in had no reason to suspect anything. It was only because Daniel, technically still locked out of the dispatch system but not out of his own saved sensor logs from the unit's internal temperature sensors, synced automatically to his phone from earlier testing, that anyone caught it that morning at all. He'd kept monitoring the logs out of habit. The temperature curve on Truck 4's shipment showed exactly what he predicted 3 weeks earlier. He called Patricia. No, he called the clinic directly, got the nurse on the line within minutes, and told her plainly what the equipment likely meant, that the insulin shipment may have exceeded safe range and shouldn't be administered until it could be verified. The nurse, startled but quick, pulled the shipment from circulation immediately. Then Daniel called Marcus. Marcus was in a board meeting when the call came through. He stepped out into the hallway. Daniel told him what had happened. The detour, the temperature curve, the call to the clinic, the shipment pulled before it reached a single patient. Marcus asked if he was certain. Daniel said he was certain, and that he had the sensor log to prove it. The same logs he'd saved before his access was cut. Marcus walked back into the boardroom and put his laptop on the table. He didn't need to make a long argument. He showed the temperature curve next to the contract specification, the invoice for the correct units next to photographs of the units actually installed, and the timestamp call log showing a shipment pulled from a rural clinic 40 minutes before it would have reached a child waiting for it. Trevor, sitting at the far end of the table, looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that the substitution needed an independent audit, and that he should have ordered one the day Daniel's first report came across his desk. The audit found that 9 routes across the contract had been running the substituted units. The supplier's invoicing matched the correct equipment on paper while shipping the cheaper model, a pattern consistent with deliberate procurement fraud rather than a one-time error. Kyle, the operations manager who had twice dismissed Daniel's findings without a physical check, was placed on a formal performance review and had his sign-off authority on cold chain routes suspended pending retraining. Trevor cooperated fully with the review. He'd been the one to call for the independent audit the moment the temperature data was in front of him, and the report noted that, alongside the earlier lapse in not escalating Daniel's first warning, the board kept him in a modified role with restructured oversight. 3 weeks later, the corrected units were installed across all 43 clinic routes. There was no press event. Marcus had been offered one and declined it, saying the families relying on that medicine didn't need to watch a company celebrate doing what it should have done correctly the first time. What happened instead was that the first fully corrected shipment reached Fairview on an ordinary Tuesday morning, on schedule, within range, logged without incident by the same nurse who'd caught the near miss weeks earlier. Marcus found Daniel in the yard that afternoon, checking the new unit thermometers against a clipboard, the same quiet, unhurried attention he'd brought to the job from the first morning. Marcus said he owed him something. Daniel said he didn't. Marcus said he knew Daniel believed that, but he was going to say it anyway, that 11 years ago, a stranger had pulled him out of a ditch in the rain and asked for nothing, and he'd spent over a decade telling himself a debt was owed to no one in particular because that was easier than admitting it was owed to a specific man. He said what Daniel had done on this contract wasn't a continuation of that favor. It was simply the same quality showing up twice, 11 years apart, in 2 completely different situations, because it was just who he was. Daniel looked at the trucks lined up in the yard for a moment. Then he said he'd spent years trying to make sure Ethan understood that doing the right thing wasn't the same as doing the easy thing, and that this contract was the first time in a long while he'd felt certain he'd actually shown that, instead of just saying it. From the office doorway came the sound of small, quick footsteps that didn't match anyone on the yard crew. Ethan appeared, backpack still on, having been dropped off by a neighbor after his dialysis session, holding a roll of inspection stickers he'd apparently found on someone's desk. He asked, without preamble, if he could help mark which trucks had been checked. Daniel told him he could mark the ones on the left, and showed him where. Ethan set to work with the careful seriousness of a boy who'd been waiting for a task that matched him. Marcus watched the 2 of them for a while, then looked at Daniel, steady, unbothered by being watched, exactly as he'd been at the desk 3 months earlier and exactly as he'd been on a flooded highway 11 years before that. Some people don't show up on paper the way they show up in the moments that matter. Daniel Cole never had a degree, never had a title that meant anything to a recruiter, and never once asked for more than what the work was actually worth. What he had was a simple, unshakable habit of doing the right thing whether or not anyone was watching, and on a Tuesday afternoon in a freight yard, that was worth more than any line on a resume ever could be.